day they handed me a cardboard box and a 2-week severance check, I didn't say a word. 23 years. That's how long I'd worked for Hargrove and Lund Structural Engineering. 23 years of 5 a.m. site visits, of pulling all-nighters to catch load calculation errors before concrete got poured, of flying out to job sites in the middle of January because some project manager didn't understand that "close enough" isn't a phrase that belongs anywhere near a steel connection detail. 23 years, and my son's boss handed me a cardboard box with a smile and told me the company was moving in a new direction. The new direction had a name. His name was Colton Hargrove. 29 years old. Son of the founding partner. Fresh MBA from Wharton. He'd been with the company 14 months. I want to tell you about the Thursday morning everything changed. But to understand that Thursday, you need to understand what the 3 years before it looked like. I started at Hargrove in London 2001, right out of my master's program at Georgia Tech. Civil engineering, structural focus. I wasn't the smartest guy in my graduating class, but I was the one who spent his summers working actual construction sites, not internships in climate-controlled offices. I knew what a concrete pour looked like at 6 in the morning when the temperature was dropping faster than the foreman expected. I knew how a weld inspector thought, what he was looking for, what made him nervous. That kind of knowledge doesn't come from a textbook. It comes from years of standing on a job site in steel-toed boots, asking questions, and shutting up long enough to hear the answers. By 2019, I was senior principal engineer. I had a team of 11. We handled the firm's largest infrastructure contracts, bridges, overpasses, a regional transit hub that took 4 years and nearly broke all of us in the best possible way. I wasn't management in the political sense. I wasn't the guy who played golf with clients. I was the guy clients called when something didn't add up. That's important. Remember that. In September 2022, old man Hargrove, Gerald Hargrove, the one who'd actually built the firm, had a stroke. It wasn't fatal, but it took him out of day-to-day operations. His son Colton, who had been doing something in business development for the previous year, which as far as I could tell meant taking clients to dinner and putting it on the company card, stepped into the leadership vacuum like he'd been waiting for it his whole life, which I suppose he had been. The first thing Colton did was reorganize the reporting structure. He brought in 2 of his business school friends as strategic operations directors. Neither of them had an engineering license. One of them had a background in real estate development. The other had spent 5 years at a marketing agency. They were making more than anyone on my technical team within 6 weeks. Then he announced the new company vision. He stood up in the all-hands meeting with a slide deck that used the word synergy 4 times and disruption twice. And he talked about how Hargrove and Lund needed to evolve beyond its traditional engineering identity to become a full-spectrum infrastructure solutions partner. I looked around the room at my colleagues. A few of them were nodding. Most of them were staring at the table. I said nothing. Over the next several months, I watched things change in ways that made my stomach tighten every time I walked in the door. Colton started pushing for faster project turnaround times. He had a phrase he loved, "Don't let perfect be the enemy of profitable." The first time he said it in a project review meeting, I thought I'd misheard him. The second time, I wrote it down in my notebook, not to remember it fondly. He started pulling junior engineers off my team and reassigning them to other projects, faster, smaller projects that looked better on quarterly reports. The depth of review he did on complex structural analyses got compressed. When I pushed back, he smiled and said we were leveraging our team's efficiency. I kept pushing back, quietly. In writing. Every concern I raised about reduced review cycles, I documented in an email. Every time I was overruled, I kept the thread. I wasn't planning anything. I just didn't know any other way to operate. When you spend 20 years making sure bridges don't fall down, documentation isn't a strategy. It's a reflex. In March 2024, Colton called me into his office. It had been Gerald's office, the one with the framed photos of every major project the firm had ever completed. Most of those photos were still on the wall, but he'd rearranged them and added a large monitor on a standing desk and a whiteboard covered in frameworks I didn't recognize. He told me my role was being restructured, effective immediately. I would no longer lead the infrastructure division. That team would report to one of his strategic operations directors, the real estate guy. I would become a senior technical advisor, a title that sounded important and came with a 15% pay cut. I looked at him for a long moment. "What does a senior technical advisor do?" I asked. "You'll consult on technical matters when the team needs you," he said. "And who decides when the team needs me?" He smiled. "The division director, the real estate guy." I took the role. I want to be clear about why. It wasn't because I was afraid. It wasn't because I needed the money badly enough to swallow the indignity. I took it because I knew something Colton didn't know. Something I'd known for 4 months and had been quietly, methodically verifying in every spare hour I had. I knew about the Delwood Overpass. The Delwood Overpass was a $220 million contract the firm had won the previous year. It was a major arterial overpass connecting 2 expanding suburbs outside of Columbus, Ohio. The project had been Colton's flagship win. He'd celebrated it at the all-hands meeting, put it in the company newsletter, used it in a pitch deck for investors. I had been taken off the lead engineer role on Delwood 6 months earlier, replaced by a younger engineer named, I'll call him, the project lead, who had 7 years of experience and was talented, genuinely talented, but had never handled a project of this scale or complexity alone. When I was restructured into my advisory role, I no longer had formal access to project documentation. But I still had relationships, and one of the site inspectors, a man I'd worked with on 3 previous projects over 15 years, a guy I'll call the inspector, called me one evening in late March. He didn't say anything alarming at first. He just asked how I was doing, made some small talk. Then he said, quietly, "You seen the revised connection specs on the east approach?" I hadn't. He said, "Somebody changed the anchor bolt schedule. I wasn't sure at first. I had to pull the original drawings to compare." I drove to his office the next morning. He spread the drawings out on his drafting table, original set and revised set side by side. I looked at them for about 90 seconds. Then I sat down in the chair across from his desk and I was quiet for a long time. The revision was wrong. Not marginally wrong. Significantly wrong. The anchor bolt spacing on the east approach column bases had been changed during a value engineering review, a cost-cutting exercise Colton had mandated across all active projects to improve margins. The change had been approved by the strategic operations director. The real estate guy, without an engineer of record review. I'm going to be careful about how I explain this because I want you to understand the stakes without me disappearing into technical language. Anchor bolts are what connect a structural steel column to its concrete base. The spacing and size of those bolts determines how much force the connection can resist, not just downward gravity load but lateral forces, wind, seismic events. Get the math wrong on an anchor bolt schedule, and the column can fail under loads that a correctly designed connection would handle without any problem. The Delwood Overpass carried an estimated 34,000 vehicles a day. I sat with this for 2 weeks. I verified everything I could verify from outside the project. I called 2 colleagues I trusted completely, both licensed structural engineers, and I walked them through the drawings without telling them which project it was. Both of them came to the same conclusion I had. Then I called a lawyer, not because I wanted to sue anyone, because I needed to understand exactly what my obligations were, what the exposure was, and how to move in a way that actually fixed the problem instead of getting buried in a company political fight that ended with me fired and the bolts unchanged. The lawyer was good. She laid it out clearly. My professional engineering license created a legal duty to report what I'd found to the relevant authorities. Specifically, the Ohio Department of Transportation, which was the project owner, and the State Board of Registration for Professional Engineers. Reporting wasn't optional. It was my legal and ethical obligation. She also helped me understand something else. The documentation I'd been keeping for the past 18 months, every email where I'd raised concerns about compressed review cycles, every meeting note where I'd been overruled on technical decisions, every instance where non-engineers had approved engineering changes. All of that created a paper trail that told a very specific story about how this error had happened and who was responsible for the conditions that allowed it. I submitted my report to ODOT on a Tuesday morning. I sent the certified letter to the state board that same afternoon. I did not tell Colton. I did not tell HR. I did not tell anyone at the firm. That was April 14th. On April 17th, I got a call from the ODOT project manager. I'd worked with him before, years ago, on a different project. He was calm, professional, and I could hear in his voice exactly how serious he was taking this. He said, "We're pulling the drawings today. Can you be available this week for a technical review call?" I said I could. On April 19th, a Friday, Colton called me into his office again. This time his two strategic operations directors were also in the room. HR was on a video call. He told me my position was being eliminated entirely, effective immediately. The firm was consolidating its technical advisory function. He slid a separation agreement across the desk. 2 weeks of severance for every year of service. Sign it and everything's clean. Don't sign it and the firm would contest unemployment. 23 years of service, 2 weeks per year. I did the math in my head while he was talking. I looked at the separation agreement. I looked at him. I said, "I'll need to have my attorney review this before I sign anything." His expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. He'd expected me to sign on the spot. I picked up the box they'd already packed for me. They'd actually gone to my office and packed my personal items while I was walking down the hall. That's how premeditated this was. And I left. I sat in my car in the parking garage for about 10 minutes. I wasn't upset exactly. What I felt was closer to a very specific kind of clarity, the kind that comes when a situation that's been complicated for a long time suddenly becomes very simple. The following Thursday, ODOT issued a formal stop work order on the Delwood Overpass project. Construction halted. The story hit the Columbus Dispatch by that afternoon. By Friday morning, it had been picked up by the AP Wire. I know what Colton's morning looked like that Friday because one of my former colleagues, someone who'd been on my team for 8 years, texted me a 2-word message at 8:47 a.m. It's chaos. The ODOT stop work order cited structural design concerns on the east approach. It named the firm. It referenced the value engineering review process. It didn't name me, but it named the engineering changes that had been approved without licensed engineer review. That same morning, the firm's general liability insurer called. Then the bonding company. Then the project's primary contractor, a large regional construction firm that had about $40 million of their own exposure wrapped up in the project, called Hargrove & Lund's managing partner directly. The managing partner, I should tell you, was not Colton. It was an older partner named, I'll call him the senior partner, who had been Gerald Hargrove's closest colleague for 30 years. He was the one who called me that Friday afternoon. He said, "I need you to come in." I said, "I'm no longer an employee of the firm." A pause. Then, "I know, I'm asking you to come in anyway." I said I would, on one condition. My attorney would be with me. We met on Monday morning. The senior partner, Colton, the firm's general counsel, the contractor's project director, 2 ODOT engineers, my attorney and me. Colton walked in wearing a suit and the particular expression of someone who has spent the weekend convincing themselves they are still in control of something they are not in control of. He sat across from me, and I watched him take in the room. The contractor's project director, who was not smiling, the ODOT engineers, who were there with a binder of documentation, my attorney, who was organized and quiet in the specific way that good attorneys are quiet when they have everything they need. The senior partner opened the meeting. He said the purpose was to establish a path forward on the technical issues with the Delwood project. One of the ODOT engineers said they needed an independent structural review of the east approach before any work could resume. They needed a licensed PE with relevant bridge experience to conduct and certify the review. Colton said the firm's engineering team could perform that review. The ODOT engineer said politely but without softening it, "We'd prefer an independent reviewer." Then the contractor's project director said, And I want to get this as close to exact as I can because I've thought about it many times since. We have $40 million in this project and a crew sitting on their hands. We need someone who can actually look at these drawings and tell us what we're dealing with. We need someone who knows this kind of work. He looked at me. He said, "We were told you were the lead engineer on this project originally." I said, "I was." He said, "Are you available?" I looked at my attorney. She gave me a small nod. I looked at Colton. I want to tell you he looked angry. Or defiant. He didn't. He looked like someone who had walked confidently into a room and was only now realizing that the floor wasn't where he'd expected it to be. I said, "I'm available, but I'm no longer affiliated with this firm, so you'd be engaging me independently." The contractor's project director said, "That works." He said it before the general counsel could say anything, before Colton could say anything. My attorney and the contractor's team finalized the engagement terms that afternoon. Independent consulting contract. I won't tell you the rate because it isn't the point, but I'll tell you it was more than my annual salary at Hargrove and Lund. Over the next 6 weeks, I conducted the full structural review of the East Approach. I brought in one of the colleagues I'd consulted earlier as a second reviewer. We documented everything. We identified 3 specific changes from the value engineering review that required remediation. We provided ODOT with a corrective design package. Construction resumed in late June. The Delwood project finished. The overpass is standing. I drove across it with my son last fall. He doesn't fully understand what happened, just that his dad was involved in building something important. That's enough. Hargrove and Lund paid a significant settlement to ODOT. The details are confidential, and I'm bound by that, so I won't speculate on numbers. What I can tell you is that the firm's general liability carrier conducted their own investigation, and the findings were not favorable to the decisions made during the value engineering review. The 2 strategic operations directors resigned. One of them, the real estate guy, had his consulting license, which wasn't an engineering license, just a general business certification, suspended as part of a broader review. Colton is still at the firm. His father recovered enough to return in a part-time capacity, and I think that's the only reason the firm is still standing. Gerald Hargrove spent several months working through what had happened. A mutual acquaintance told me he was devastated. I believe that. He spent 40 years building something real, and it nearly came apart in 14 months. I haven't spoken to Colton since that Monday meeting. I don't expect to. I run my own practice now. Small, intentionally small. I take the projects I want to take. I have 2 engineers on staff, both of them younger than my work boots. I am very specific with them about what we do and why we do it the way we do it. There are no value engineering reviews that bypass licensed engineer approval. There is no compression of review cycles to improve a quarterly report. When we sign our name to a drawing, that drawing is right. I still get calls. Other firms, contractors, project owners who've heard about Delwood through the industry grapevine, the work comes to me now. I don't chase it. Here's the thing I keep coming back to. The thing I'd want anyone to hear who's been in a position like mine. I didn't win because I was clever. I didn't win because I outmaneuvered anyone or engineered some elaborate comeback. I won because I did what engineers are trained to do. I identified a problem. I documented it carefully. I followed the process that exists for exactly this kind of situation, and I told the truth to the people who needed to hear it. The separation agreement, by the way, I never signed. My attorney negotiated a significantly different arrangement. Colton's team had underestimated a few things. That was one of them. I'll tell you what I think about most when I think about all of it. It's not the Monday meeting. It's not the stop work order. It's a conversation I had with the inspector, the site inspector who first called me. About 2 weeks after construction resumed on Delwood, we were standing on the East Approach, looking out at the framework, going back up. He said, "You know what the worst part would have been? If nothing had happened. If the overpass had opened and everything had been fine for a few years, and then one winter, bad freeze-thaw cycle, heavy load event, and the connection fails." I said, "Yeah." He said nobody would have known why. They would have called it an act of God or a freak accident. They would have never connected it back to the bolt schedule. I've thought about that for a long time. 23 years of making sure bridges don't fall down. That's not a career achievement. That's a reason to get out of bed. No MBA program teaches you that. No quarterly report captures it. You either understand what the work is for, or you don't. Colton didn't understand. And in the end, that was the only thing that mattered. I've had a lot of time to think about what actually happened. Not the stop work order, not the Monday meeting, not the contract. I mean what actually happened. The chain of it. The way one decision leads to another until you end up somewhere nobody planned to be. Colton didn't set out to nearly destroy a bridge. He set out to look impressive. That's the thing people miss when they tell this kind of story. The villain isn't usually someone plotting harm in a back room. He's someone optimizing for the wrong thing. Quarterly margins, the appearance of leadership, the approval of people who don't understand the work, and refusing to slow down long enough to hear from the people who do. Every shortcut he took made sense inside the logic he'd built for himself. And that logic had no room in it for what a licensed structural engineer actually does, or why it matters, or what happens when you remove that layer of review from a $220 million piece of public infrastructure. That's what I want people to understand. Not that arrogance gets punished, though sometimes it does, but that competence is not decorative. Experience is not a personality trait for older workers to feel good about. It is load-bearing. When you remove it from a structure, the structure weakens, sometimes slowly, sometimes not until a bad winter and a heavy load event 3 years down the road. But it weakens. I wasn't trying to take Colton down. I want to be honest about that because I think the revenge framing misses the point. I filed that report because 34,000 cars a day were going to drive over a connection I knew was wrong. There was no version of that situation where I stayed quiet and felt good about myself afterward. Not for a day. Not for an hour. My name is attached to this industry. My license. My 30 years of understanding what it means when steel meets concrete and the math has to be right. You don't get to set that down because it's inconvenient for someone else's quarterly report. Gerald Hargrove built something real. I watched him do it over 20 years. He understood that the work was the thing. Not the brand of the work, not the pitch deck about the work, but the actual structural calculations, the site visits at dawn, the arguments over connection details that nobody outside the industry would ever care about or understand. His son understood none of that, and because Gerald got sick at the wrong moment, there was no one in that building with enough standing to slow Colton down before the damage was done. That's the part that stays with me, not the victory. The gap between someone who knows what the work requires and someone who thinks knowing what the work is called is the same thing. I think about the inspector a lot. The guy who called me on a Tuesday evening and said quietly that something didn't look right. He could have said nothing. It wasn't formally his call. He was a site inspector, not the engineer of record. But he'd been doing this long enough to trust what bothered him, and he trusted me enough to make the call. That's integrity, not the dramatic kind. The quiet, unglamorous kind that most people never see. Someone doing the right thing with no audience, no guarantee it'll matter, no certainty about how it'll land. I try to run my practice that way. Small, careful, deliberate. The 2 engineers on my staff hear me say it often enough that they probably hear it in their sleep. When you sign your name to a drawing, that drawing is right. Not approximately right. Not close enough for the timeline. Right. That's the only standard that survives contact with reality. Everything else, the buzzwords, the frameworks, the disruption, fades the first time something actually goes wrong. The overpass is standing. I drove across it with my son. That's enough.